This is the Ohio Adult Allies Podcast. Welcome. Here, our mission is to develop, inspire, and empower youth leaders. Our topic for today is, what are the social determinants of adolescent health? With special guest, Dr. Kathleen Tebb. Now here's our host, Belon Hill.
All right. Hello, everyone. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to tune in to Adult Allies Podcast. My name is Belon Hill. I will be serving as your host. And I work for Youth to Youth International, where we do youth-led programming within Ohio and internationally as well. So today, one of our goals is to basically get an introduction of social determinants of health and social determinants of adolescent health. So we are super, super excited. We have Dr. Kathleen Tebb here today. So we have the pleasure and opportunity to interview Dr. Kathleen Tebb during today's session, and we will be discussing, like I mentioned, social determinants of adolescent health and social determinants of health. So I am going to pass it over to Dr. Tebb to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her.
Thank you so much, Belon. I'm just incredibly honored to be here today and have the opportunity to speak with you and your group. I'm a professor in the Division of Adolescent Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. I'm a developmental and health research psychologist, and my research focuses primarily on understanding the factors that influence adolescent and young adult health. In their risk-taking behaviors, with the focus on developing and evaluating interventions targeted many different levels. So community-based settings, the individual, primary care, non-traditional health delivery settings, and public policy. So relevant for today, I've conducted a couple of studies to understand and identify strategies to address social determinants of health.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. Well, we are so happy to have you here. We're going to kick it off. Just in general, one of the first questions we wanted to ask is we just want to begin with getting your personal definition of social determinants of health. I know there's the dictionary, but we just want to get your personal opinion of how you define that.
Well, as most of you already know, when we talk about social determinants of health, they're really the upstream factors and that influence health outcomes. They're the structural and socio-ecological factors that influence how we live, grow, play, and work, which is somewhat of an overlap of the World Health Organization's definition.
Totally agree. And it's such a wide span. When you look at it, almost everything affects that. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint because, it's anything that surrounds you definitely affects that as well. So with that separately, how would you explain social determinants of adolescent health? So kind of the difference between that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. You got my brain thinking here. When I think about social determinants, I think it's helpful to think about it in two different levels. So one category are like the structural determinants, which refers to the ways in which society is set up with regard to like the social, the economic, the health, and the political constructs, these bigger issues. These structures create divisions that lead to differences in status, power, privilege, and access to resources and information that adolescents have. The second category are the more proximal or the determinants that are a little bit closer to the individual. And these really refer or involve the circumstances of daily life that more directly influence a person's attitudes and behaviors. Of course, proximal determinants are shaped by these larger structural determinants, as well as, more local, cultural, religious, and community factors.
Totally agree. And I like the way you were able to break that up because it is different structures to it. So totally agree with that. Another question we wanted to look into, what are the key distinctions when focused specifically on social determinants of health with youth population as opposed to adults? So kind of what's the difference between adolescent and adults?
Well, as a developmental psychologist, this is the space that I live, work, and play, right?
Yes.
So, many of these structural and proximal determinants affect adults and adolescents in similar ways. I think the important distinction is that adolescence is a unique developmental period in the lifespan where there's really rapid changes in pubertal and biological growth and brain development changes that make them particularly influenced by their environments in which they live, grow, and play. So they have a more they potentially have a more powerful and profound effect on adolescence.
Yes, I totally agree. As a mother of a sixth grader, totally agree. They are definitely it's a huge time in terms of development, and I would looked into that and reading just some of the big times in our life where our brain is developing. And so it was so neat to read. And I always say it's great to know that as a parent, was having a sixth grader to know, like, okay, these things may be happening in her life because of what she's going through. So,
Exactly. And I'm
mhm,
really glad that you brought up the example of your own daughter because what you see in her life and what we see in the lives of a lot of adolescents is is different trajectories. So these social determinants lead to variations in young people's exposures and vulnerabilities to health risks through the quality and nature of their family, their peer relationships, the availability of food and housing, opportunities for recreations, their school environments, even their exposures to environmental toxins, substance use, and violence. So we see these different trajectories that are really led by these social determinants.
yes, yes, definitely. And, even, with work I've done in the field, being whether it's a different age group, you see that depending on the demographic. So some school districts you go into, you're able to have the youth that have an understanding, and able to participate. And in some less fortunate, maybe like I said, low income or so a different socioeconomic status, you may notice, like I said, we would go in with snacks, and just the basis of, hey, they need food to be able to focus or, and stuff like that. So it is those simple things of knowing how to cater, depending on what those young people have access to.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I totally agree. And one of our other questions we wanted to ask was, why do the social determinants of adolescent health matter? Like, why is this a big deal? You almost kind of explained it, but I guess just, for our audience to see, like, why is it so important?
I don't think we can really underscore the importance of social determinants. They really have one of the most powerful influences and persistent influences on unjust health equities that we see. In fact, research shows that social determinants of health account for as low as 30% to as much as 80% of health outcomes. So, what that means when we think about this is that even the best medical care, on average, will extend and improve the lives of adolescents less than the combined effects of good nutrition, access to places to be physically active, safe and healthy homes, healthy communities, lack of chronic stress, adequate social supports, et cetera, et cetera. So really these factors matter critically when we think about the opportunities and environments that our young people have.
Exactly. Exactly. And, and with that is, I think one of the most important things is just getting our communities to understand this as well. I think a podcast like this and this topic is very important because I don't think a lot of people in the community are able to make that connection. So I think, like I said, the work that you do is amazing. And again, just getting that sense of awareness out there is so big because I think once we're able to have that sense of understanding, then people will be able to make that connection as well.
Can I add another little point to that issue? I think we grow up in a culture that places a lot of emphasis on individual responsibility and individual accountability.
Mhm.
And for young people growing up, that can, when they see themselves experiencing outcomes that may be different or disparate from others, it can lead to that internalized sense of failure or less value. And so this social determinant lens actually takes this and flips it around entirely and says, look, it's not your fault. It's not the fault of your
Exactly.
family. It's not the fault of your community. It is these larger systemic factors that are at play. And we need to really address those so that everybody has equitable access to healthy, happy, fulfilling lives.
Yes. And that I'm so glad you pointed that out because when you're in it, you don't see it. You don't see it as something bigger. You do a lot of young kids will say, well, it's my fault that I didn't get these good grades or, it's my fault that we don't have access to this. And we have heard that, was working with young people and being able to, like you said, take that burden off of them and help them to understand that it's bigger. It's very important because it can help them navigate, as they grow up throughout the process.
And it can give them voice and empower them to see that they can be agents of change in addressing these factors to improve the lives that they live and the lives of others in their communities. I really believe in youth engagement and the power of engaging youth as equal decision makers is
Yes.
making systemic changes.
Yes. And we're huge with that, with the adult allies is making sure the youth have a voice, and making them a part of, decision making. Like you said, policy change, anything that involves them, they need to be a part of it. And it's almost kind of getting that, perception that, a young person is to be seen, not heard, it's like, no, they deserve to be heard. Exactly. And another question, I think one of our final questions we have here is what broad trends are we seeing in terms of adolescent health as we emerge from the pandemic? So, are we seeing trends as we're emerging from that?
Well, I think what's received one of the most attention, and rightly so, are the mental health issues that have resulted or have been exacerbated by the pandemic. We saw an increased trend pre-pandemic of increased mental health problems, but I think the pandemic has really just amplified disparities that we were already seeing in communities. And again, completely related to this topic of social determinants of health in terms of who has access to be able to work at home and who has access to be able to protect themselves by being able to isolate in a spare room in the house. Having to go to work, having to step up because maybe your family member's sick. So the adolescent has to take a job and has less time for schoolwork and the social isolation that goes with it. I mean, adolescence, that social is one of the biggest developmental tasks that they have. And the
Very cool.
pandemic really fundamentally disrupted that for all young people.
Yeah, it definitely did. And, something as simple, like you said, I have three daughters, but my daughter she was starting kindergarten, during the pandemic. And that's where like, she wasn't going to get that experience of entering into school. And so we tried really hard to try to find a way. But the biggest thing is mental health and working with an organization that works with young people. We saw that, a lot of them were battling, with, like I said, anxiety and depression. And then we kind of noticed they kind of drew back from participating in youth groups, from that. Yeah.
For sure. And we can't forget the trauma that so many young people and young people of color experienced with greater disparities in the death of family members and friends. I think that you mentioned we're coming out of the pandemic, but we're still very much in it. And
Exactly.
so many people are still suffering and suffering the fallouts of loss of life and long-term impacts of COVID. And so I think the stress and anxiety is still ever prevalent, especially for adolescents who may live with their elderly grandparents or have to take care of family members who may be disabled or vulnerable, and they're out in the communities or out in school, and they're very worried that, they might come home and inadvertently transmit COVID to one of their loved ones who are vulnerable. So there's so many layers. When you start talking to youth about these issues, you really begin to understand how difficult it is. And then I think we also need to think about not just the mental health, but just the logistical digital divide that we've seen during COVID, and access to internet and computers and technology. Those who come from more affluent communities and schools and neighborhoods have greater access. And so they were able to stay on Zoom meetings and so forth. I've seen some innovative projects where, the school bus was outfitted with Wi-Fi in a
I've seen that. Yeah.
in a Native American community, and went to the school, and people kind of gathered as they could. But it's still, we have a long way to go, and that's here in the US. Think about developing countries and the digital divide.
Yeah. And and that is a very important point you made. Like, I was able to understand my privilege of being able to work from home, and when our kids were doing basically in school from home as well. And it was something I've always been grateful for, is acknowledging I was able to be there, to be present, to make sure they were getting the work done. When I talked to some of my peers, that wasn't the case. They were like, I had to go to work. I had a friend that's a flight attendant, and, you're relying on other people to come in and make sure that that's taken care of. And it caused a lot of a burden on the parents, and guilt of, I still have to work. And then the kids stepping up to the plate and having to take on responsibility that usually isn't their own. So
Absolutely.
we've definitely seen that. And what we wanted to do to wrap everything up, we wanted to see if there were any type of like final advice, with us seeking to understand social determinants of adolescent health and, better educate our peers on it. Like, what advice could you give to us?
Well, I'm not sure if it's advice as it is maybe perspective.
Yeah.
I'm not one who's great about advice, but I think, I have a slight challenge with the term social determinants, meaning that it's everything's predetermined. And that's not, I want to make sure that when we think about social determinants of health, that we don't think about it as deterministic, in that youth are incredibly resilient. And as they're developing in adolescence, the brain hasn't fully matured. So as much as it creates an opportunity for risk, it creates an opportunity for resilience. And I think we as adults and adult allies and partners with youth can really think creatively about all the ways in which we can work together across disciplines to support adolescents be more resilient. And that involves not just working with individual adolescents, but the places in which they live, grow, and play.
Yes. No, thank you. And I love you being able to point it out as, like you said, a determinant, because I've never looked at that from that perception whatsoever. And also, again, just acknowledging the resilience that are in young people, again, giving them their power that they actually have. So it is great advice. You don't give advice, but it was great advice. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and a big thank you for Dr. Kathleen Tebb for giving us this opportunity to, as I say, pick your brain and use those resources to help us grow. So thank you.
Thank you to our special guests. For more information about their organizations, feel free to use the information on screen or below in the description. Thank you to our listeners. This has been the Ohio Adult Allies Podcast. For more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, and more. You can also find our episodes and more information about us on our website, ohioadultallies.com.